It's a great honor to speak here. I'm really pleased to share with you some of the things we have learned about agriculture, and I have learned as a person, not just about the Netherlands, but about food and agriculture in the world. And actually, I think there's not a more propitious time to be concerned about food and agriculture than today. It's a wonderful subject. It's absolutely important. Without food, we do not survive. But food and agriculture are also part of our history. They're part of your history. They're part of what made us human beings. The first agriculture was the beginning of the first cities that were growing, of developing the art of writing. All that is related to agriculture. So agriculture is absolutely essential, and I speak about agriculture and food in one go because it's really the food chain, indeed, from farm to fork, that we are concerned about. Now, in this whole subject, I'm only highlighting a few things because I could speak for days and hours, and I'm sure you don't want that. But so let me give this a start. I want to start actually with the fact that this year in Russia is the year of ecology. And that is important because for a long time we thought that agriculture and ecology are in opposition. You're either in favor of the environment or you're in favor of agriculture. One of the things that we have done very successfully in the Netherlands is rationalizing agriculture in such a way that we do not damage the environment. And in general, I would say, if there's one message you want to remember, that is, if we do our agriculture well, and we make sure we get the best of the best possible land, we also have a way to protect the environment. And you, here in Russia, I took some beautiful pictures, you have some fantastic environment, and although it seems as if there is a lot of land, if we're not careful about agriculture, we get a lot of chemicals in the environment that may have very far away effects. So agriculture and ecology are not in opposition, but actually they go hand in hand. And one of the important things, I think, for every country is to establish that dialogue between food, agriculture, and environment. Having said that, it's not all that easy, and here's why. First of all, this is just from the year 1700 to about the middle of this century where our food comes from. And the most important thing for you to remember is that the area of arable land has increased very much. And thanks to the Green Revolution, we are, you know what the Green Revolution is, higher yields per hectare, more irrigation. We're actually able to feed today's population. And the blue is actually what we call the blue revolution. That's the food that comes from the sea and from surface waters. Now here's my prediction. In the next 10 to 20 years, there will be more food from the sea. And not just food from the sea in terms of fisheries, but food from the sea also because we will learn to use other species, such as algae, for example. Algae are a very important source. Does everybody know what algae are? What are algae in Russian? Do we know? Okay, so you know what I mean. Algae are a source of proteins. They're also a source of oils and all kinds of other things. So it's a very important source of food. But what you learn here is that we have been able to feed a growing world population because we have expanded the land area. So we've just put more land under production. There still is land, also in this country, but by using a lot of land, we cannot always protect the environment. So the key is that we use the best land to get the best possible yields. And fortunately, you have some very good soils here where you can actually get very high yields. We still have to face about a doubling of the world food production between now and about the middle of this century. And that is because a lot of people are still consuming too little, and their demands for food will grow as they become more affluent. So there's a tremendous challenge for us here. A tremendous challenge also for a country like Russia, because you will and are good and big producers, and there is a role for the rest of the world that needs to be fed as well. It is technically quite possible to do that, to feed even more than the 9 or 10 billion people that we expect on this earth. But it's not going to be right automatically. We need a lot of effort to do this well. Here's why. First of all, if this is a small graph, and I'll make available for all of you the graphs so you can look at them. We'll put them possibly, Madam Ambassador, on the website so you can all look at it in detail. What you need to remember here is that actually our yields have gone up very dramatically. That's the yellow line. And since about 1,000 years ago, but it's only quite recently. And this is in the middle of the last century. This is where the real changes started. Why did they change? Why did we suddenly, after this gradual improvement, why did we suddenly have better yields? It was because we had a better control on production. We knew how to put the chemicals, we knew how to improve the genetics, the chemicals being fertilizer, but also pest and disease control, and we knew how to manage water. And that is in fact what we often call the Green Revolution, which started in Occidental countries like the US and Europe, but went very quickly to Asia and other parts of the world. That Green Revolution now is also needed, but in a different, even smarter way for the future production. And at the same time, if you see on the other hand, the number of people we needed per hectare, that's the white line, has decreased. These are figures from the Netherlands. So today, or not even the Netherlands, just Europe, today we only need 12 man-hours per hectare to produce the best possible yields from the 600 that we needed quite a few hundred years ago. And that is a real revolution. That revolution is still possible for the future because we have to do better. And one reason why we have to do better still is that there are fewer and fewer people living in rural areas, and there are fewer people who actually want to work in agriculture. So using better mechanical equipment, including the most modern equipment, think of drones or self-driving tractors, that is all possible, and it's all needed still there, because we have already today 2/3 of the world population in cities, and that will increase even more. And the big cities will be fed by fewer and fewer farmers. That is unfortunately the reality everywhere. So if you look at how we have to look at the future, then you see that actually our growth has to come from growing slowly the food, and that means both the yields and the hectareage, but mainly the yield. And if we do not move to that red dotted line, there will be a difference between demand, what people want, and what we actually make available. These are world figures, but in certain countries this will work out really very badly. Countries like, or a continent like Africa really worries me a lot. May seem far away, but at the end of this century there will be 4 billion people living in Africa. There's no way we can feed these people currently. Now, if you see that here we can reduce demand also by producing more. We can actually get a best possible result now by avoiding the losses. We are still, in many countries, losing between 30 and 40% of what is actually on the field, which doesn't reach the consumer's plate. That's because we have losses during harvest, but we also throw away a lot of food. We have losses in slaughterhouses. We can do much better. And even more interesting, if we reduce those losses, we can actually retrieve some of the nutrients that are in those losses. Now, why did we actually get better yields? Because we have, in many countries and in many places, we have actually tried to get the best genetic solutions to get the plants, in this case, adapted to a new environment. So drought, saline conditions, salt in the soil, for example, really has helped us to avoid some of the problems of losses during, or low yields during the season. And there is an interesting story here, of course, behind that, and that is what the future of climate change will do to our crops. On the one hand, higher temperatures will mean in a country like Russia that you can grow grains more to the north, but at the same time, higher night temperatures will have an additional pressure, for example, on pests and diseases. So more humidity, more summer rainfall. So on the one hand, higher yields, but on the other hand, also more pests and diseases. And this is where our work on genetics has to help to really improve the crops even further. Now, let's move to food, because after all, we do agriculture not exclusively for food, also for fibers, such as cotton, but mainly also for food. Now, we always think in terms of food as a kind of pyramid. There are all kinds of levels of food here, from the carbohydrates at the bottom all the way to the sugars and the proteins in the middle somewhere. What is important on food is that many of you may think, there are good foods and bad foods. Who thinks bad foods exist? Lots of people think bad foods exist. Now, bad foods actually do exist in terms of food that is poor, that is poorly produced, or that is polluted and so on. But in your diet, you actually need all of these. And it's very dangerous to actually not eat as diversified a diet as possible. And that means also that agriculture has to be diversified. If you want to remember one thing on diet, it's not that there are bad and good foods, but that it's diversity that counts, and moderation. So a little bit of everything, and it doesn't matter, mind the title of my book, it doesn't matter so much if you eat a hamburger from time to time. Who eats a hamburger from time to time? Yes! See, all of you eat a hamburger from time to time. Nothing wrong with a hamburger as such. It only becomes a problem if you eat it every day, 3 times a day. I'm sure you don't do that. But on diet, we now know that actually there are only 2 laws on diet. It's diversity and it's sufficient fiber. Fiber is another thing because it's very important to get the gut moving. Agriculture, therefore, has to offer that diversity. And fruits and vegetables are something that also in Russia we consume too little. So if there's one sector which really needs a lot of attention, it's fruits and vegetables, because of the fibers, because of the vitamins, and because of the diversity. Now, of course, one of the things we need to do is to deal with animal production. And I will come to this in more detail. Animal production is important. Of course, you think meat, you think proteins. But it's also important because animals, in particular these broilers and these kinds of animals, actually can reprocess some of the waste foods that we do not eat. So they're actually quite important in what we now call a circular economy. What we really want is to try and have as little waste as possible from the whole agricultural sector, including the food processing sectors. And so our thinking today in the Netherlands is very much, let's try and use and reutilize all the molecules that are somewhere in the system, because that's the best way to protect the environment. Now, interestingly enough, we have more problems sometimes with the free roaming chickens, although some of you may think it's very nice for the chickens to walk around and, do all the things chickens want to do. And this is, they're with a lot, and we easily identify with chickens. These poor chicks, they must be more unhappy than those. Well, in fact, these are quite unhappy sometimes because, first of all, they get infected quite easily, more easily with bird flu, avian influenza, than these who are protected. But also there is more competition, and chickens by nature are somewhat aggressive. And so this is actually a situation where there's more stress, and we actually measured the stress hormones in the blood of the chickens. What I want to say here is that we have different systems. There's not one blueprint for agriculture. There are many ways in which we can conduct agriculture, but what we need to think about, what is the best possible option, the choice for a given set of circumstances. If you don't have a lot of bird flu and you don't have a very aggressive breed, that's probably a solution. If you want to be sure of hygiene, this is the solution. This obviously also has a higher productivity because these poor babies, they all are cold or they're too hot. So that is all detrimental to production. Now, of course, the key issue in agriculture is what is the optimal scale? And you have a lot of history showing that large scale is not by definition the best solution. We also know that if a farm is too small, there's also a problem because you need some economies of scale to invest, for example, in tractors and so on. And defining the optimal scale is one of the most important things that countries and regions or rayons need to do. There's no simple answer, but big is not always better. Small is not always beautiful either. And defining that and doing that in a rational way is really very important. In the Netherlands, for example, our farms are quite small, but they're so rationalized and they have such high production potential that it is quite possible for farmers to live that way and to make a living out of that. You have a lot of land, so the tendency will be to go for big farms. It's maybe something we can discuss, but there are also diminishing returns, and big farms don't always have the highest yields, interestingly enough. Now, one big issue in agriculture and food is organic food. Do you all think organic foods are the best solution? Who thinks that? Right, interesting. If I would have asked this question in Europe, half of the group would say, yes, are organic. So maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. Organic has a number of drawbacks. One, for example, very important aspect, in any case here in Russia, is that it's poorly defined. So there is no regulation, there is no certification, and that means that there is always a lot of confusion to the consumer. Organic is interesting because it commands a premium in the market in some cases, but it has some real problems. One is that you cannot use normal chemical fertilizer. Now you might say, well, chemical fertilizer also has its drawbacks. But there are soils, of course, and those are not your deep, beautiful black soils, but there are many parts where you cannot grow crops without fertilizer. If you do that, you exhaust the soil. Organic also often means that you cannot use normal pest and disease control measures. Organic agriculture obviously uses that because any agriculture is a fight between pathogens and crops, so you do need something, but they use different things and often actually quite heavy metals, which are not necessarily a good solution. But above all, if you use manure in organic farming, then you need far more land. And this is our main concern. We have calculated very, very strictly what is possible. And roughly speaking, if we wanted the whole world to go organic, we need 6 times more land than we have today. And that is just not an option. I personally think that in about 20 years' time, and I see a lot of young faces, so that's good, you will all be able to remember these words. In about 20 years' time, I think we'll get the best elements from organic farming and the best elements from what we now call conventional farming. Organic has one very important part, and that is it makes the consumer aware of the fact that there is a tendency to overuse chemicals, that there is a tendency to pollute the environment. So in that sense, I think the organic movement has a very important role that it has played. But we shouldn't be too rigid about it, in my view, and I leave this for the discussion. I think we can get the best elements and use just as little fertilizer as we really need. And I see in the Netherlands that with our growing yields, we in fact use, even per ton of produce, less fertilizer than 40 years ago. Now, of course, proteins, my favorite subject. For all of you who want to be put to rest, this is an American picture, of course. Not Dutch, not Russian. But proteins are a serious issue. Proteins, of course, you all know, they're absolutely essential to our survival, to our muscles, our brain, and what have you. Without proteins, we wouldn't survive. Protein malnutrition is one of the worst things that can happen because it means that children, for example, don't have the right type of brain development. Where are the future proteins going to come from? One thing we know is that when people get more money, more income, they will buy more animal proteins. Now, animal proteins come in different categories. They come as milk, as eggs, milk and cheese. They come of course, as red meat and as the white meat, the broilers, chickens that we saw before. They all have their advantages and disadvantages. So it's not easy to say, I'm against meat or I'm against animal proteins. On top of it, one thing to remember is that animal proteins allow also a certain form of iron to be more easily absorbed by the gut than any other produce. So for those populations, particularly, for example, women, pregnant women and young children and the elderly, animal proteins combined with iron are really quite important. The advantages of red meat are that we can have cows grazing in areas which cannot be used for agriculture. And that's very important. There are large parts of the world, even in this country, that are too cold or too wet or too steep. We cannot grow crops. That's where grazing is important. Chickens, as I said, and also pigs can convert some of the food leftovers that we cannot consume. And of course cows, but also other multi-gastric, so with more stomachs, animals like goats, for example, or sheep, can convert grass into proteins that we can consume. There's no way to do that in a factory, or not a cheap way at least. So animals are important. We also have fish. So in the whole scheme of things, we do need proteins, but we have to do it well. Right now, animal proteins are actually the thing that govern the world market prices for grains, because we are feeding animals concentrated food, and the concentrated food has to come from other parts of the world, not least, for example, from Brazil. And that is a used transfer, if you want, of nutrients from one part of the world to another. But people will continue to eat proteins and to need proteins. Proteins can also come from beans, but also from cereals, from all kinds of other things. Can we feed the world, those 9 or 10 billion, in the future with only animal proteins, or do we do something with the vegetable proteins? My answer to that is we need a combination. And sometimes quite literally, we can actually combine about 30% vegetable proteins into animal proteins in processed meats, and consumers will not notice it, and they get the right type of protein combination. So that's a good idea to do. Can we get a better production level of animal proteins? Yes. We can certainly do much better than we do now, particularly also, and also in this country, on milk production. So there's a lot of scope to do better, but it requires very careful fine-tuning. Animals are not like plants. Animals are more delicate, more complicated. They need to be fed well, they need to be looked after in a better possible way. I think we will not move to a world without meat. But we will move to a world, again, where the diet is diversified, where we have animal and vegetable proteins in all kinds of combinations. And maybe we don't all need to eat 400 grams of steak every day, such as the Argentinians do or some of the Americans do. We can do probably with much less. And if you want to know how much animal protein you need, or how much protein you need, just count about 0.6 grams per kilo of body weight. Then you know. So you can calculate at home. Good. Fish is another interesting subject, because with fisheries, actually, we are way behind agriculture. We still consider the ocean, 2/3 of the world's surface, as a source, a free source of proteins, of fish. Then, of course, since a couple of decades, we know that cannot continue. We exhaust the fish stock. So we're moving slowly to aquaculture. You're doing that already for salmon, for example. In many parts of the world, that is now the future. Interestingly enough, this also, of course, causes a lot of problems. Some things go well. Sometimes there are problems with disease control, with contamination of wild populations. So we really have to do a major effort in getting our aquaculture right. But it's very sure that already now about half of the production of proteins comes from fish, particularly aquaculture, and that will only increase. So doing a great effort there, and maybe also bringing in the algae and so on, will help us to solve the protein riddle. Now let's look at pollution. you know, this is the thing that people often think about when it comes to agriculture. If you look here, I'm showing how much actually we can improve, and we have improved in the past the quality of the environment over time. We're doing much better now than we did in the past, and these are not even that recent figures. How did we manage that? First of all, by having efficient agriculture, but also by helping farmers to find the best possible techniques, for example, to protect birds. And under the European agricultural policy, there is actually a kind of subsidy, if you want, or a compensation for a farmer who leaves some of the land fallow in order to protect the birds. That is a concrete way of integrating the environmental concerns with production. Now, let's move to cities, because cities are the future, 2/3 of the world population, and our great problem will be to get food to cities that are over 10 million people. There are already 20 cities like that, probably quite soon 30 or 35, and that will only increase. The key question here is, how do we get it to the consumer? What they call sometimes the last food mile. It's easy to grow food everywhere, but how do you get it into the cities? Well, one solution is, of course, to start growing food in the cities. Now, that's not too easy, because most soil in the cities is heavily polluted because of factories that were there before. Soil is also very expensive in cities, so doing it just in cities is not a good idea. But greenhouses, artificial greenhouses, so there is no direct lighting, this is all LED lighting, are actually a solution. It's an expensive solution for now, but it's quite conceivable, and this is also a discussion we have with architects, to build in buildings that are going to be established in any case, possibilities to have both the solar lighting for the energy, the water system, so that you actually have a greenhouse maybe in the basement or at the top of all the new buildings. And wouldn't that be an exciting idea, that you go in your own building and you just harvest some of the green vegetables that you need? Well, we're far from that. But it is a possibility. And interestingly enough, some of the greenhouses we are experimenting with now in the Netherlands actually produce energy. They don't ask energy, they produce energy because of the very efficient system. And this is all closed cycle, so again, a circular economy of the use of water. This is still very much, of course, for high value vegetables, so it's not a solution. And in any case, there's no way in which I think we can grow our carbohydrates, so our potatoes, our wheat and so on, in cities. But for vegetables and fruits, and remember I said those are the important crops also for our diet, we can do more of this. So we call this vertical farming. And there are all kinds of ways in which we can do that. You can have it on trays at different levels. You can have it indeed growing vertically. There are many ways, but all of this is, you can see, it's hydroponics. It's enclosed basins in a way, and there's very little water is being used. Temperature control, of course, by computer, all that. It is still expensive, but with the reduction in the costs of the technology, and I think with well-trained people, we can actually make a success of this. And this is my, it doesn't show my favorite object in the world, at least in Wageningen, is our robot that collects these tomatoes. We have a robot that actually makes a 3D image of every single tomato and very carefully picks it with a plastic hand in a totally hygienic, sterile way. And it does that much faster than people. And the robot can see the difference between what is not ripe and what is ripe. So you have no waste, because human beings sometimes look at something and say, okay, this looks ripe, but then it isn't ripe enough and you waste it. So the robotics there are also a big step towards better control and better quality. Now, one of the things it hinges on is the quality of the lighting. This is something we need to manage, because if it's too hot, the plants don't grow. The other thing we do in greenhouses, which is very important, we have done away with all the chemicals. So all the products that you still know of open field agriculture, for example, to control wheat rust, we don't need any chemicals in these greenhouses. The only thing we have are some small insects that actually eat whatever pathogen there is. But there are very few pathogens because it's a closed system. And here is an important rule actually underlying future agriculture and future food production. That is, the more we have control over the factors of production, the better we are for the environment. And the better it is also economically. Now, we call this way in the greenhouses, in a more general way, integrated pest management. And what we do is, as much as possible, to try to control things in a biological, breed, ecological manner. So we do it mechanically with weeds, we do it with resistance in the crops or in the animals against diseases, and where necessary we have the biological control that I just showed you. And only as a last resort now we use chemicals. And that is really a change from 30 years ago. The chemical use in Dutch agriculture is only 10% of what it was at its highest. So it is possible, therefore, to have highly intensive agriculture and yet protect the environment. Now, the robots, this is my favorite baby, my robot baby. The one that gets, this is a bell pepper, but the idea is the same. Perfect, sterile, and quicker, and it has no back pain either. And it works at night, in the dark even. I said, the whole idea is towards better control of production systems. And the better control also comes through another development, which again sounds a little futuristic, but is getting cheaper and cheaper, and that is the use of drones. And the drones, and a thing like this costs about 300 euros nowadays, this is the easy form of it. Actually, the drones allow us now to have what we call a precision agriculture, where actually to the detail of 1 to 2 centimeters, we can measure things like the canopy color, which means that we know how well the plant is fed, for example, the nitrogen content, whether there are any pathogens. We know something about the water stress in the plant. We know something about the soil if there is no plant. Actually, everything you, in the past, assessed by walking through the crop, you can do by drones. And that is an enormous improvement, not just because you have a better control of the production factors, but also because it becomes then possible to monitor, for example, what happens directly outside the field. Is it going well with the environment, with wild plants? Or, for example, to have strips of crops and strips of other different crops, so that you have a mixed cropping, which in traditional systems actually is not so much possible. So the drones actually are a very important tool for precision agriculture. They also can be used to follow herds of animals, for example. We even use them in Africa, for example, to follow herds of wild animals. And maybe one day the drones will actually deliver your food on your doorstep directly. So now I do want to stress this issue of fertilizer, because I really want you to remember precision agriculture, protecting your environment. And if there's anything you want, or not just fertilizer, I should say chemicals in general, if anything you need to remember, it is don't put too much, do the right amount. Not too much, not too little. Do it at the right moment, when the plant can actually use it, and not before or after. And do it in the right composition. There's no point in giving too much nitrogen if the plant cannot use it, or if there's too little phosphate, for example. And do it on the right spot. If you do that, again, as I said, the chemical use can be reduced dramatically. And that is so important, not just for the environment, but also for the farmer's income. So optimal resource control leads to low emissions and high resource use efficiency. And that is the secret of Dutch agriculture. There's one other very important development, because I've been talking about chemicals and mechanization, but there's one other thing that is really the revolution of these times. It's a revolution that's not even 3 years old, and that is new breeding techniques, or precision breeding. It is the new techniques. Sometimes they're called CRISPR-Cas. Don't look at this, it's too complicated, even I don't understand everything here, but what you have to remember is this. Up to about a couple of years ago, genetic modification or classical breeding were the only ways to change the genetic characteristics of a crop or an animal. And now we have a way of doing that, genetic changes, with enormous precision, so only for 1 or 2 genes, and to do that very, very quickly. And also to do it in such a way that the end result is not necessarily a genetically modified organism. It's very important to remember that. So this CRISPR-Cas technique, it's a completely different thing. It's really compared to the classical breeding or GMOs, it's suddenly going from the cart and horse to having a Ferrari or whatever. You must have a non-Italian equivalent of the Ferrari. But anyway, a fast car that does exactly do what you want. Let me give you a few examples so that you understand what I'm talking about. One is, for example, that we can wake up so-called dormant genes. So in every organism, there are genes that actually are not being used because they're not relevant to that particular condition. Tomato, for example, has a lot of dormant genes, and those genes, in fact, codify for a better, a higher quality of certain chemicals that are in the tomato. For example, also better vitamin content. The tomato doesn't need them because the tomato did not evolve to feed others, it evolved for itself. But we humans like having better quality tomatoes and also tomatoes that last longer. We can actually wake up these dormant genes by using CRISPR-Cas. Very important development. And by the way, this is a real plea for fundamental research. The CRISPR-Cas technology was not developed by a tomato breeder or an apple breeder. It wasn't even developed by an agronomist, not even a medical scientist. It was developed by some people who are doing completely different fundamental research on a so-called archaebacteria, a bacteria that's 3 billion years old, and that happened to have a very weird way of protecting itself against viruses. It actually cut out the virus DNA. And that technique could then be used, and somebody was bright enough to think, hey, that's a good idea for breeding, and that's how we developed that. So sometimes, quite often, we need fundamental research in order to get a real breakthrough. Now here are the tomatoes, and you can see if we actually have these better shelf life genes that I just talked about, or better vitamins, we can actually keep tomatoes much longer. And that's exactly the key also to reducing waste. So it's an example where genetic modification, in this case through CRISPR-Cas, helps us to attack the waste problem in a very substantive way. Now let me just move to the algae for a minute, because the algae are interesting not just because they produce proteins and oils, they can be used as biofuels, but also because they can be integrated in an urban environment. I talked to you about greenhouses in cities, but we can also think about algae production in cities. Perhaps, you know, in the future, again, in 20 years' time, in all Moscow's parking lots, underground parking lots, we will have algae. It's interesting because it would be the first time that we humans actually start again to really exploit a new species. Of course, we've done a few things, you know, the kiwi is quite recent and so on, but in terms of really using species in a systematic and large-scale way, algae would be my #1 bet. Now, let me move to another extension of what we are working on, and we call that the Internet of Food. Have you heard about the Internet of Things? Does that ring a bell, some of you? Yes? Now, the Internet of Food is actually the food component, the whole food chain component of that. And it's extremely important for the future. I'm absolutely convinced that this is the future. It means a lot of things. One, for example, is that we can actually trace every single product all the way from the farm through the processing and the markets, through the supermarket to the consumer. That means that you will know exactly when was it produced, where does it come from, how long has it been stored. Even today we have little sensors that show you exactly the temperature exposure of the packaging so that you know that something has not been exposed to heat but has been at a constant temperature. It means also that those of you who are interested in really truly authentic Russian food or Italian food, you actually can have that guarantee built in the Internet of Things. It helps us also to target things specifically to your needs. And I wouldn't be surprised if in a couple of years' time, we will all wake up with a little chip in our wrist, which in the morning says, well, it's time for some extra calcium. And it will tell my fridge to prepare the milk with the extra calcium for me, or the yogurt. And then the fridge tells back into the system, no, the calcium yogurt is finished. It then tells my computer, order more calcium-enriched yogurt because she needs calcium yogurt. Well, not sure whether I actually like the idea, but it will be possible. Consumers and producers will be connected. And it means also that farmers with specific products, specialized cheeses, for example, will be able to sell directly to consumers. There's a whole story here that I will not tell now about using blockchain and Bitcoin as an extra guarantee to indeed control the quality and make sure that it is indeed a true system. But the Internet of Food is something to remember, something that links production, including the details on the drones and so on, including the whole road, if you want, the pathway of the food through the factories all the way to your plate, which is a guarantee for quality and for food safety. And this is one of these labels that I just mentioned. It just tells you exactly how long, how many hours, and how long it will still be good for the quality, your consumption. And that is, it's not around the corner, it's there. And it's so cheap now, this sensor, that it can be particularly on every package of meat or fish, so that you have a guarantee as a consumer that this has not been tampered with, that it is the same quality, and that you have the safety that you want. But why go to a factory if we can do something at home? Let me take a guess. I think in 25 years, we will all have one of these things in our kitchen, if not much earlier. This is a 3D printer for food. It means, it sounds horrible. I mean, I don't want printed food at first thought, but you know, it allows me again to tailor-made food to my needs, including my genetic needs, for example. Okay, I'm a person with low calcium, so I need extra calcium. I can actually put in a paste, a mixture with carbohydrates, with extra proteins. If by that time I probably need that badly, I need lots of extra calcium. And it prints my spaghetti or a kind of potato simile, or even something that looks like meat, just for me, tailor-made for me. Is this a good solution? Not for everybody. But for example, for elderly people, for hospitals, this is what's going to happen. And people like this. I know young people who find this a very creative way of looking at food. So let's leave it at that. But more importantly, more urgently, I said it already several times, let's reduce food waste. 30 to 40% is thrown away. You do it at home. Next time you throw away something, ask yourself if it couldn't have been saved, or if it wouldn't have been a nice idea to take it and use it for something else. And we can do more. We can actually with, for example, certain types of, say, leek, you know what leek is, or onions, you can actually make textiles out of them as well, and use proteins. Water is something I have already dealt with a little bit. You see here how these advanced systems look like, how it can be done in the field. Water shortage is not a global problem, but it's a local problem. But it needs local solutions, and it needs local negotiations also between the environmental people, the bird protectors and so on, the farmers and other users of water. This is going to be one of the key sort of diplomatic problems also when these are transboundary problems. But it's not a global problem as such. Now, I already talked a little bit about our personal health, so this is the kind of, this actually exists on the market. It tells me about my calcium, my iron levels and so on, and it actually makes for this move towards a personalized nutrition. One of the things that will really determine our environment in the future are supermarkets. Supermarkets are an essential feature of cities. They have their good and their bad things. You know, there's sometimes, like here, we sometimes think there is also a supermarket choice stress, what to choose. But supermarkets will increasingly, of course, have to give way to internet buying and selling. Already in a city like Beijing, 25% of the food is actually sold through the internet. But the supermarket has a role to play in making the consumer aware. They drive some of the changes of the new thinking. And more, I think supermarkets will be places of experience more than just places where you buy your food. And the confusion that's in this supermarket, you also have it on the internet, if not worse. So, thank you very much. This is my last sentence. I wanted to say, remember, the future of agriculture and food is linked to better control over production factors, precision agriculture, and looking at the whole chain from agriculture, food processing, to you as a consumer. The consumer can do so much in driving a healthy, sustainable, and environmentally friendly agriculture. We have done that in the Netherlands, and we're very willing to share our experiences with you, because it's actually quite possible to do so much better than we do today. Thank you very much again.
Natalia, she's a journalist, and she has a question about the influence of agriculture on the climate. And then she goes a little into detail, and I won't be able to translate it very well. Maybe, Maria, can you help me?
Yeah, because I'm a student of Glasgow School, also, maybe you know our university, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
We also read into this problem about the traditional farming and about its influence on the environment. So the question was about CO2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
about CO2 and about the
yeah. Okay, yeah, that's a very good question. I left out the climate thing as a whole because I had to limit somehow, but you're absolutely right to address that. Agriculture has various effects on emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. One important one is, of course, methane and NOx, the nitrous oxide side of things, through the stomachs of grazing animals, and methane also through irrigated rice. Now, for the stomachs of grazing animals, particularly cows, we are actually working in two ways to reduce that. One is to change the gut bacteria, so the bacteria in the intestines, so that they will emit the less methane, because in fact it's not the cow itself, it's bacteria that are digesting the fibers that emit the methane, but also through changing some of the composition of the feed, so that there is less chance of methane being formed. That's one aspect. And the third way to reduce that is actually by taking out the methane in the stables through some kind of filter system. So there are actually ways of having cows with a lot less methane emissions. It's one of the reasons why having cows indoors is better than having them outdoors, unfortunately, for some people, but that's how it is. The other thing on methane in rice, there is also some work on bacteria and various other microorganisms that will help to reduce that. Then, of course, CO2 is a complicated issue. On the one hand, there is energy use in agriculture, and the more mechanized agriculture is, of course, the more CO2. However, all the general changes there in terms of having better engines, more efficient fuel use, maybe also some small electrical tractors will actually help. You can't use electrical tractors for everything, but for certain things, yes, will help to reduce CO2 emissions from the mechanization side. Then, of course, if we clear land, we actually release CO2 through the burning of the vegetation, or the CO2 that's actually incorporated in the trees, for example. That is a short cycle CO2, so if we regrow that vegetation again, then we fix some of that CO2. That's less worrying than the fossil CO2. Then, of course, we have here in Russia and also in Canada, for example, and northern China, the major issues of permafrost and the releases of greenhouse gases that come from there. That is a major engineering issue. I think we're just starting to grapple with, I'm interested to hear afterwards, with how we could reduce some of that. But for agriculture as a whole, I think we can do a lot better. The main contribution has been, and not so much here but elsewhere, is the combination of deforestation, mechanization, and general waste and so on. Again, if you waste food, you also produce in a way CO2, because it's not being used for human consumption or animal consumption. So I think a truly rational, circular economy will help very much to reduce that problem very, very seriously. And of course, on the positive side, higher CO2 levels actually help plant growth. A plant uses CO2, as you know, photosynthesis, which you all learned in school. Photosynthesis uses CO2, so greater, especially higher temperatures with CO2 actually means that plants grow faster, and therefore we have also, again, CO2 fixation. Thank you.
My name is Lisa. I work in public relations, and thank you for a wonderful speech. I hope to see the realization of these ideas as soon as possible. My question concerns vegetable oils and the usage in Russia and in Europe, because it's being demonized in Russia a lot, and as I know, in Europe the situation is not...
You mean palm oil in particular?
Palm oil, yeah.
Because there are many vegetable oils.
Palm oil.
Okay, yes.
And your opinion, is it bad, good, or should we switch to other oils?
Well, there is a whole hour to be filled with oils alone. We won't do that. Palm oil is, say, of moderate use in human health is not a bad idea, because although it has a different composition of fatty acids, it is a good source of energy, and it is, if it's not refined, also a good source of vitamins A and D. However, palm oil comes from a palm tree, and if the palm tree is grown in a plantation where previously there was prime forest, then of course the deforestation itself is a major problem. If that was also forest, such as for example in countries like Malaysia, that is standing in a kind of marshland, then even the cutting the trees and drying the marshes also emits more methane. So you have a double problem there. There are some international agreements on what is called the Round Table of Sustainable Palm Oil that you may be aware of. And there the absolute rule is that palm oil that comes from deforestation is not allowed and is not certified. Now, of course, this is always a problem to control, hence my plea for the Internet of Food, where we would know where things come from. But in principle, if palm oil is grown sustainably and if it's used in small quantities, it's not bad. But of course, it's not a substitute for milk fats. So palm oil in cheese, frankly, coming from a cheese eating and producing country, is not such a good idea because it doesn't make the cheese any better. So it's a complicated answer, but yes, if you have sustainable palm oil, I think you can be quite tranquil. Yeah, I see a lot of fingers at the back. Yeah, right, yeah.
Thank you for your lecture. My question is about production of proteins by insects. Can you say something about it?
In fact, you remind me of the fact that I had a very nice picture of insects, and then I showed it to one of my assistants, and they said, no, in Russia they don't want to see insects, take it out. Anyway, yes, insects are an interesting source of protein, and then we talk about different types of insects, both worms, for example, and also termites or various other things. However, they are not without their problems, and that's why we do quite a bit of research. I even wrote the first introductory chapter to the world's first English language recipe book for insects, which you can find on the, well, I'll give all those details to you later. So yes, I'm in favor of insects, but with moderation. Why? First of all, there's very little we know about possible toxic aspects of insects for human consumption. There may be a number of problems that we're not aware of, and it's very difficult because there's so many different insect species to monitor everything at the same time. Secondly, insects don't come free. If you want to grow them, they need warmth, they need heat. They also need to be fed. They actually do emit also greenhouse gases, particularly methane actually. So there is a lot of things, and if you do the calculations, it's not sure that the proteins from insects come out a lot better in a total life cycle analysis than some of the other proteins. Now, why am I still interested in insects? Because they can be a very good source of animal feed, and particularly fish feed. And that's where we should look at more systematically. Those are sometimes also different insects. And, feeding fish and feeding animals, of course, needs to be done in the most efficient way. And there, I think there is some scope. Of course, feeding insects to human beings is a problem in most countries. Not in all countries. There are countries where it's a tradition. I was not so long ago in Mexico City, and they had although I speak quite good Spanish, they had a dish that I didn't understand. So I thought, brave as I am, okay, salad with something or other. And the something or other turned out to be huge crickets, this size. Okay, I'm brave, but not everybody likes that. So insects are a problem. We do have ways of for example, having some insect meal, for example, in pasta or in bread, but it's not very well accepted. And I think the route towards feed is a more logical one, at least in the short to medium term.
Hello, my name is Andreas van Rossum. I'm a Dutch student at the Higher School of Economics here in Moscow. I have a question about vertical agriculture in urban areas. I was just wondering how this can be developing in the future, because it turns out, at least in my opinion, this is a very good development. But you mentioned that it was very expensive, so my question is, how do you see this developing in the future? And does this have the possibility to spread to other countries, for example, with harsher climates, since there's climate control in those areas? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yes, I see a lot of potential. First of all, especially when you have new buildings built, because then you can build in the whole water storage system, for example, or whatever you need in terms of heating. LED lighting becomes cheaper and cheaper. And because these are closed systems, they are actually not that expensive once you have them. It's installing them which is the main thing. And then, the work with architects there is quite important. So I think there's a great scope. It doesn't ask a lot of water, it doesn't ask a lot of energy, but it does ask very, very good quality control, because once you have a disease, or once you have a problem, or once your computer is not controlling the environment or the climate very well, then immediately everything dies. Is this a solution for harsh climates? Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you incorporate it in a building, in a basement, in a parking lot, or at the highest floor, of course you can do that in a building. It is in a controlled environment. We're actually looking at this now also, for example, in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and countries like that. And there the interesting thing is that it yields so much energy that we can actually cool the greenhouses, which is a problem in some other countries. So I think there's a lot of scope to do this well, but it's really highly qualified labor that you need for that, and highly qualified management. But that's something that I think we are developing very much in the Netherlands, and I'm very happy to share with all of you.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I'm Alex from Russian Agricultural Academy. My question is, what do you think about organic food or quality of food problem produced in Russia?
The quality in general, or just organic?
Yeah, in the whole.
Well, I think in organic food in general has a problem here, as I said, because of the certification issues, so you don't know exactly what you're buying. It is a myth, we looked at this very carefully, that organic food in itself has a better taste because of the agricultural production methods. What happens, however, is that sometimes in organic or local produce, it's a different variety of apples that's being used, and then it's more tasty because it's not the same variety. So going back to some of these traditional varieties, I think it's a very good idea for fruits and vegetables, whether you grow them organically, yes or no. And you have a long tradition, for example, also using turnips, which are hard to find nowadays, and using other types of roots and tubers. So going back to some of that again is, I think, the positive side of the organic movement, trying to get back to some of these traditional foods and prepare them in new ways, make people aware of what is local, what's in season, and so on. And yes, of course, Russian food is Russian food, so it's good. If it's well, like with all cuisines, if it's well prepared, you know, if it's prepared with love, as we say, then it must be good.
And you had borscht last night.
And I had borscht last night, of course. I always have borscht.
My name is Alexander Demkin, and I'm a graduate of Moscow Engineering Physics Institute. And well, currently I'm working for the beverage industry. And I would like to ask a few questions about beverages, but my scale is a bit bigger. I would like to go on a larger scale. And the question is, imagine a world where all the problems of agriculture and urban planning are solved. And the crops are growing, the cows are not methane producers, and so on, and every person has their share of food every day. But will it create a feedback loop, a positive feedback loop, which will result in growth of population and further problems? So, and is there a contradiction between these two?
That's an excellent question. In fact, I just sort of walked away very lightly from the issue of demographic growth. And if you remember my first graphs, we have had, of course, a substantial growth of world population in the last century. However, that population growth, the growth percentage, so not the absolute numbers, is leveling off. And there is actually one key law, a social science law behind that, and it is if women are educated and they marry later, which is related to education, they get fewer children. And if the children actually do survive as well, then within 2 generations, and I have a very nice graph on Twitter, if you look at my Twitter account, which I just published last week, that in 2 generations, we have been able to move the world average of number of children per woman from, I think, 5.6 world average to 2, or 2.1. And that is even actually already a little bit below normal reproduction rates. So what will happen is actually not only that the population growth is leveling off between 2050 and 2100, but that world population is actually going down again. And this is irrespective of food levels. It's not such that if people are better fed, they will get more children. In fact, it's the reverse. When people are poorly fed and have, of course, no access to birth control, they will actually get more children, because the children are also a way of surviving. So the predictions for the longer term, and then I'm talking about a few centuries from now, are in fact that world population is declining rapidly. Such that, for example, Italy, which now has about 50 million inhabitants, will in the year 2200 only have 2 million people. That is irrespective of migrants, so that, you know, the image may still change. The place where population growth will continue, there are two places. One is India, one is Africa. And that is indeed a reflection of poverty. But when people are better fed and they go to school, it is not what you expect. And that is where human beings, so it's a very clever question, where human beings are fundamentally different from animals. If animals are better fed, they expand their territory, they get more offspring, and they will grow bigger and bigger. But human beings have more goals in life usually than offspring, and hence being better fed and getting older actually means a completely different demographic composition. By the way, the fact that we are getting older so much and so quickly means also that we have an acute labor problem and a problem of the proportion between the young who are working and the elderly who are dependent. That is, in a country like Japan, is already a major problem. Japan is the developed country which has been under replacement rate for already two decades. It will happen here as well. So food is, in contrary to what you think, not a driver for population growth.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, it's not me, yes.
My name is Elisa.
Oh, sorry.
I recently graduated from Amsterdam University and did my master there. So the question is concerning their fundamental part of the agriculture. What would you say about the possibility of growing meat in the labs? How far we are at the moment? Because since you mentioned the possibility of 3D printing food, so yeah, how far we are now to actually put it on the market and sell it? Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure whether everybody understood that at the back. This is a question about another subject where we can talk an hour on growing meat in the lab. And this is indeed being done in two places in the world, in California and in the Netherlands. And that means taking cells from animals, especially muscle tissue, and growing that into a steak. That is possible. The proof of concept has been given. Right now, the steak in the lab costs about 24,000 euros per kilo, so it's not quite competitive. And if you ask me, I think that is not the future. It's not the future because you still need animal cells, and there's just no more efficient way than to grow them on an animal rather than... So unless we get a major shift in public opinion and nobody wants to have animals anymore, then possibly that becomes a solution. However, as you say, 3D printing is also a way of making a sort of meat-like substance. That is what we do quite successfully in Wageningen, but we don't do it with animal cells, but we use plant cells, particularly soybean cells, and we make, not in a normal extruder, but really in a 3D way, we reconstitute the fibers of the muscles. And if you see the meat, then it really has the look, the feel, it's not meat, that's meat, quote unquote, the look, the feel, the texture, the smell of a normal steak. So before it was already possible to make meatballs and all kinds of unstructured things, but now we are, through this technique, we can actually make plant protein textured steaks, and the technique, for those of you who are interested, look it up on the web, is called shear cell. So it's actually tearing the cells apart and reconstituting new cells. And I actually think that that is a possibility, but more logically and cheaper and easier will be to substitute part of the animal protein by plant proteins in such a way that, you know, you're in meatballs and so on, we can have that. We can easily do that already. The future will be probably less meat, better quality, and not every day.
My name is Fertilizer. I'm from from Russian State Agricultural University. The question is about your present job. In the title of your institution, it says it is University and Research Center. With your international experience and all various work you have done before, how would you describe what is the major mission of your institution? Is it education or research? Or if they go along together, you know, how would you divide your time and attention to each of them? And a little bit about the educational program you provide. Thank you.
Okay, I cannot probably address all the details, but you're right. Our name is not just university, it's Wageningen University and Research. And the research part is actually what used to be the research centers of the Ministry of Agriculture, which were taken away from the ministry and put in a kind of umbrella next to the university. So in fact, I'm the boss of two things. I'm the boss of the university and I'm the boss of the research centers, which are about 10, 11 centers in different locations in the country. They are about applied research. The university has its own research, which is more the fundamental research. And one of my missions in life is to try to link the fundamental research better with the applied research. So in two ways. So the concrete questions from society can be translated sometimes into very fundamental work, and vice versa. Some of the fundamental work, such as this CRISPR-Cas, can actually have a real impact in practical work, in the applied research. So that is one very important way in which we work. The other way in which we do our research is that we make it very interdisciplinary. So we're not having separate veterinary research. We have, in fact, a working group called One Health, where we have ecosystem health, including vectors, all the way down to consumer health, food safety, and animal health, that's the veterinary part, all that linked together. So people are still working in a disciplinary department, but they participate in interdisciplinary programs. That we find very useful, and it makes it also more flexible. So you do a project for a couple of years and then you may also change. Now on the education side, that's only the university, but our students also do some practical work with the research institutes. That's not compulsory, but it is a possibility for them, and sometimes they like that very much. The details of the program, I think it's best if you look them up on the website, but basically we have 11,000 students, and we have a bachelor's and a master's. Nearly everything is now in English, and in the master's we have about 45–46% of non-Dutch students. And there too, the curriculum is, although you have a disciplinary basis, it's also very much geared towards trying to work with other disciplines and being also practical and not just theoretical. And that generally works well. We have been rated now this year for the 13th year on a row as the best educational university in the country. Because we have small groups, it's very focused, and it's very concrete. Students like that.
Okay.
Come and visit, I would say.
Okay.
Добрый вечер, меня зовут Максим. Вопрос. Смотрите, те технологии, о которых мы говорили, это довольно дорогие технологии. Их могут себе позволить только те страны, которые уже решили свои продовольственные проблемы. Соответственно, Африка может надеяться только на нашу щедрость. Вопрос, предположим, мы подарили 100 автоматизированных ферм для Африки. Сколько из них будет функционально, например, через 3 года, и сколько из них будут все еще функционировать через 5?
His name is Maxime, and the question is the following. The technologies you described, they are very advanced. The countries that have them are countries that have already solved a lot of their other problems. They're the more developed countries. So other countries depend on the gifts of more richer countries. So the question is, if we would, as a gift, give 100 automized farms to the African continent, how many of them would be able to get to working and would be still working after 3 years, after 10 years?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, there are two things I want to say. The principle that's behind that optimization is a principle of closing the cycles and not losing things. And the technology is a tool. It's not a purpose in itself. So for many years, of course, also Dutch farmers didn't use that technology, but still tried to close the water and chemical cycle. That is a lesson for Africa as well, a lesson that's not always applied. At the same time, you should be surprised at how many advanced farms and investments there are currently in African agriculture. They're making a big jump, just like they went from no telephone to a mobile phone without passing through the landline. They go in various areas, actually immediately to more advanced farming. It may look a bit different, but the interest in drones, for example, in Africa is certainly existing. Would I give 100 farms to Africa now? No, I wouldn't do that. Because I first want to train people. And I want to make sure that there is private sector support and that there is a government policy that actually allows you to fly the drones, for example, that there is safe land tenure, that there is a market, and there's a whole lot of conditions that need to be met before you can start the technology. And what we should never forget is technology is not an end in itself. Technology is a help. And it helps differently. That's why we need different types of technologies. And there are some very interesting, very small scale tractors that are actually not bigger than a vacuum cleaner that can help farmers, especially elderly farmers and women, to plow the land. Because the alternative, doing everything by hand, is something that nobody wants to do. Here, not here, but also not in Africa. So mechanization is a must because of the labor shortage. But from mechanization in a simple sense to drones, that's still a big step. That requires all these other conditions.
Hello, my name is Anna.
I cannot see you. Where are you?
Yeah, you.
Ah, there.
I'd like to thank you for a great talk. I found a lot of the things you said about plant agriculture in particular really interesting, and the future that you envision for it seems really cool. But I also noticed how you focused on sustainability and efficiency, but you also said that you see the future of like food and agriculture with a mix of animal and plant products and proteins, etc. So I'm sure you know that animal agriculture is one of the least sustainable industries in the world, and given that there are over 50 billion animals that are slaughtered each year, and each of them takes space and needs water and food, and makes an enormous amount of waste that's toxic and is just like thrown into water and on the ground. I'm just curious, why do you think that is also part of the sustainable future of agriculture and food? Thank you.
Well, it's a very interesting question, and I don't think I agree with all you say, because you generalize a little bit too quickly. For example, I would not defend scientifically that all animal waste is toxic. I think that's not something you can say. In fact, we should reuse some of that waste, again, because these are useful minerals and proteins. Secondly, there are huge differences in the ways in which animals are grown. And again, the more you control the environment, the more you close the cycles, the fewer the effluents to the environment, the fewer the emissions and so on. So it is true that we have some major problems, including some health problems, but there are, as I said, also areas where we have no alternative. If you look at Inner Mongolia, if you look at southern Argentina, if you look at Australia, or even if you look at some of the parts of the Netherlands that are too wet, there are large areas in the world where you cannot grow crops. Yet animals are a way to transform plant proteins that we cannot digest into something we can digest. So I firmly believe, and we at Wageningen firmly believe, that animals, in moderation and in well-tended systems with no effluents or fewer effluents to the environment, are part of a sustainable equation. Not least because animals, particularly those chickens, can actually digest some of the waste, and otherwise the waste will go to waste indeed. So not all animal systems are as bad as you described, and the manure itself can be a very important source of new materials. In fact, we have a slogan in our university, manure is gold. Yes,
Thank you, Louise. Well, happy to rejoin with you again and hear you here, but just I have some little upset. Well, the audience is young, well, not very much mature people in the room, and nobody raised the question which shows that the world will be different. Well, you spoke about technology and what will be, how to... You spoke actually about future for the world, where we go, how to feed the world. But food, I'm an agricultural economist, it's not my topic to speak, but food is a part of the human culture, like art, music, and architecture, whatever. And for us, well, robots can do music, robots can paint. And, well,
my composer friends would say differently, but yes.
No, I say they can do it, but we all understand that, we still would like to have real art and real music, etc.
Sure.
What is the future of real food? Who will eat it? Who can afford the real food? Not meat-like 3D product, but real meat. And this is actually a follow-up with the question of the gentleman who asked about what we'll do with the third world, when they will get and how they can get in these new technologies, etc. And now my question is a social. Well, who will afford real food in the future? Thank you.
I think it's an interesting question. We can debate a long time about what real food is. But I think you mean things that come directly from the land and so on. That will still be the major part of our food. But it might be grown in a way that is different. I mean, a bell pepper will still be a bell pepper, whether it is actually collected by a robot or whether it's collected by a human being. And there are many reasons why we have less labor available nowadays in agriculture than before. So we can be very nostalgic and say, no, I only want to have bell peppers or tomatoes that are collected by human beings. But the future is that there are not many people who want to do that work. And that is a reality. Now, yes, we can get migrant people to do some of that work. Some of them do under very poor conditions. It's just very heavy work to bend over and pick those tomatoes. So for me, tomatoes, whoever they are picked by, are still real food. Now the other part of the equation is, do we want 3D printers in all our homes? That feels a lot less like real food, of course. So you could say, well, at least if there are options. And I think the 3D printer, as I said, is probably something for hospitals, for institutions, for elderly people. And if you are very old, with the demographic composition, maybe people want to stay at home, but maybe they are not able because their hands are, not as flexible as before. Maybe they're not able to do all the cooking themselves, let alone to peel the potatoes. Well, some help of that in that process, I think, still is part of the real food debate. Now, a third dimension of that is, of course, that food is identity. And so food is culture, indeed. Food is something with which you say, I am me, because, for example, I'm a meat eater, you're not a meat eater. Those are worlds apart. Expressing your identity through food is, of course, very important, and you will want to do that. So you will want to have a choice, to have access to the food that you want to eat, whether it's avocados or pears from your own hometown or fish from your own hometown. Well, the fact that we have the internet actually makes it more possible for a pear grower somewhere in Russia to actually market his pears to you specifically. You can actually order on the internet. Is that real food or not? Or is it only the food that you buy personally in the market? Is that real food? There is a whole complex issue of how we define real food. I'm certainly not saying that technologically high-tech food is the only solution. I'm only indicating that there is a strong trend towards labor-saving techniques, towards getting a better handle on food safety, to have more efficiency in water and chemical use because of the environment. And those things really require a much better control of agriculture and food production than before. And yes, what we eat actually today is also not even what our grandmothers used to eat, let alone, 400 years ago. So real food is not fixed in time. It evolves with us just like our cultures evolve.
Obviously, there are many more questions to ask, and it's a topic, and everything that's connected to it, that is a very strong topic also here in the audience. For those who would like to know more, actually the book that Mrs. Fresco published is translated into English, Hamburgers in Paradise. There is a documentary which you can actually watch also on YouTube, which is called Fresco in Paradise. She's very active on Twitter, so there's many more opportunities.
And TED Talk.
And yes, and the TED
Because
Talk.
that's translated into Russian.
And the TED Talk I hear is translated into Russian. You can find this information and also the presentation that she gave also on our website, DutchScienceTalks.com, and we will email you as soon as we have it online. Also from the embassy, we would like to thank Professor Fresco, give her a very warm applause, and see you at the next talk.